So here we are again, just 2 years after the last great war between the successors of Alexander the Great. Another one breaks out. The ink is barely dry on the settlements from the last bloodbath, and already the same men who have spent decades fighting, scheming, betraying, are at it again. Because for these men, power is never enough. See, when Alexander died in 323 BC, he left behind the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and no clear successor. It was an empire that stretched from the shores of Greece to the mountains of India. But an empire is only as strong as the hands that hold it, and with Alexander gone, his generals, his most trusted men, weren't about to just sit back and let someone else rule over what they thought should be theirs. So they fought, and they kept fighting, through war after war, tearing apart what Alexander had built in a brutal contest of ambition. And in 307 BC, the contest was far from over. Ptolemy, down in Egypt, had been quietly, but aggressively, expanding his influence. He was reaching into the Aegean, securing Cyprus, fortifying his naval power. He had carved out a kingdom that was, at least for now, stable. Meanwhile, Seleucus, out in the east, was consolidating his hold over the vast lands stretching from Syria to the farthest reaches of Alexander's conquests. But Antigonus wasn't going to wait. He had always been the most dangerous of Alexander's successors, and he had spent years preparing for another shot at dominance. And so, the war began again. This time, Antigonus sent his son, Demetrius, the man history would remember as Poliorketes, the besieger, to retake Greece. And what a figure Demetrius was. If history had action heroes, Demetrius would be one of them. He was charismatic, bold, and most importantly, he was good at war. In 307 BC, Demetrius arrived in Athens, a city that had been under the control of Cassander's governor, Demetrius of Phaleron. Now, the Athenians? They had not forgotten what it meant to be free, and when Demetrius stormed in, they didn't resist. In fact, they welcomed him. He kicked out Cassander's governor and, in an act of political theatre, proclaimed Athens free once again. And that was a big deal, because Athens was still Athens. It had a name, a history, a legacy. If Demetrius was in control of Athens, he wasn't just some warlord. He was a liberator, a champion of Greek freedom. At least, that's how he wanted to be seen. But Athens was just the beginning. Demetrius set his sights on an even bigger target, Ptolemy. He turned his war machine toward Cyprus, the strategic island that Ptolemy had been using as a naval base. If Demetrius could take Cyprus, he could deal a serious blow to Ptolemy's ambitions. And that's when things got really intense. In 306 BC, the two sides met in what would be one of the greatest naval battles of the era, the Battle of Salamis. Not that Salamis, the famous one from the Persian Wars a century and a half earlier, but another Salamis, a battle just as dramatic in its own way. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of warships lining up in formation, the sun gleaming off their bronze rams, the sound of drums and oars splashing in unison. This was naval warfare in the ancient world, massive ships packed with marines, built not just for sailing, but for boarding, for ramming, for brutal hand-to-hand combat on the decks. When the dust settled, Demetrius had won a stunning victory. Ptolemy's fleet was shattered. Not only did Demetrius win, he captured 40 of Ptolemy's warships intact, crews and all. That was huge. Capturing a ship meant adding it to your own navy, strengthening your fleet while weakening your enemies. But the real prize? Over 100 of Ptolemy's transport ships, loaded with some 8,000 troops, were taken. Just imagine that. 8,000 trained soldiers, ready to fight for Ptolemy, now in the hands of Demetrius. It was a crushing defeat. Fresh from his son's stunning naval victory at Salamis, Antigonus saw an opportunity. He declared himself king. No more regencies, no more mere claims to legitimacy in Alexander's shadow. He crowns himself, and he places his son Demetrius at his side as co-king. It's a move that will send shockwaves through the ancient world. Now, to understand the audacity of this moment, we have to step back. Because the Macedonian throne. It had been in a state of chaos since Alexander's death in 323 BC. His legitimate heir, Alexander IV, had been murdered by Cassander in 309 BC, and since then, the Diadochi, the successors, had danced a delicate and brutal waltz of power. For years, these men had paid lip service to the idea that they were guardians of Alexander's empire, stewards of his legacy, pretending as if they were merely waiting for a legitimate heir to emerge. But by 306, that pretense was dead. And when Antigonus took the title of Basileus, or king, it was an open challenge to all the others. And the others? They weren't about to let him get away with that. Upon hearing of Antigonus's self-crowning, his rivals acted swiftly. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, Lysimachus in Thrace, and finally even Cassander in Macedon, they all followed suit, crowning themselves kings. The illusion of unity, of a single Macedonian empire, shattered once and for all. Each now ruled as sovereign, each now laid claim to their own piece of Alexander's shattered dream. And in the midst of this chaos stood Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, the man history would come to know as Demetrius Poliorketes, the besieger. With his father's blessing, Demetrius launched a campaign across Greece, sweeping through central territories, expelling Cassander's forces from key strongholds. By the spring of 303, he had entered the Peloponnese, taking Sicyon and Corinth, expanding his father's influence further. He moved like a storm through Argolis, Achaea, Arcadia, bringing the northern and central Peloponnese under Antigonid control. Demetrius formed a new Hellenic league, the League of Corinth, reviving the very institution Alexander had used decades earlier to rally the Greeks under his banner. But this was not a league for the sake of Greek freedom. No, this was a league with himself and his father at the top, a tool to solidify control over the Greek world and position themselves as its protectors. Cassander saw what was happening and knew he had to act. He sued for peace. But Antigonus? He was not a man for compromise. He rejected Cassander's offer outright. And so Demetrius marched north into Thessaly, clashing with Cassander's forces in battle after battle, though neither side could claim victory outright. But here's where history throws a curveball. Because while Demetrius was fighting in Greece, his father's position in Asia was being threatened. Lysimachus, one of the kings who had declared himself sovereign in response to Antigonus's move, saw an opening. With Demetrius occupied in Thessaly, Lysimachus launched an invasion of Anatolia, forcing Antigonus to call his son back from Greece. Just like that, the stage was set for a final confrontation, a showdown that would determine the fate of the Antigonid dynasty. For Antigonus, it must have felt like the climax of a long life of struggle. In his 80s now, an age practically unheard of for a battlefield commander, he had spent the past 20 years fighting, scheming, and warring to reclaim the empire that Alexander had left behind. And now, here he was, leading an army of 70,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 75 war elephants. Because, just as Antigonus thought he had positioned himself well, the balance shifted. From the east, Seleucus I Nicator arrived to reinforce Lysimachus and Cassander, bringing an army that was smaller in infantry but contained a trump card Antigonus could never have predicted: 400 war elephants. Now, this was a staggering number. War elephants were the superweapons of their day, massive beasts capable of crushing infantry underfoot, terrifying cavalry into flight, and sowing sheer chaos on the battlefield. Seleucus had acquired them during his eastern campaigns in India, and now they were here on the plains of Ipsus, poised to change the fate of the Hellenistic world. And so the battle began. Demetrius, eager to make his mark, led the cavalry charge against Seleucus's right flank. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like he might break through. His elite companion cavalry smashed into Seleucus's forces, and they started to push them back. But Demetrius, so very much like his father in his boldness, made a crucial mistake. He pushed too far. He drove his cavalry deep into enemy lines, so deep that he lost contact with the main battle. And that's when Seleucus made his move. With terrifying precision, he deployed his elephants to cut off Demetrius's retreat. Suddenly, Antigonus's son and his cavalry are trapped outside the battlefield, unable to return to help their embattled phalanx. And the moment Demetrius is isolated, the tide turns. Antigonus looked around. His massive phalanx of 70,000 men suddenly finds itself leaderless, surrounded. What does he do? He calls for reinforcements, he calls for help from his son, but the battlefield had already turned against him. His men, seeing their doom, began to surrender, to flee, to defect. What does it feel like to stand on a battlefield at that moment, watching everything slip away? Antigonus did not run. He was old, he was proud, he stood his ground. And in that moment, the last great dream of Alexander's empire died with him. The javelins fly, the spears thrust forward, and the one-eyed king, the last man who could have truly put the empire back together, was cut down. Seleucus and Lysimachus divided the spoils. Seleucus took Syria, Mesopotamia, and the vast eastern satrapies. Lysimachus strengthened his grip on western Anatolia and Thrace. Demetrius, realizing the battle was lost, fled the field with what remained of his cavalry. Thanks to his formidable navy, he was able to regroup and escape to Greece, but his influence was permanently crippled. The Battle of Ipsus marked the final great war of the Diadochi, as it was the last conflict in which all the major successors of Alexander the Great fought against each other. From this point forward, wars would continue, but in smaller, more localized struggles between individual rulers. And that's the tragedy of the Diadochi, isn't it? These men, these brilliant, brutal warriors who once fought under Alexander, couldn't stop fighting. They couldn't stop killing each other over the empire they had all helped to build. In the end, nearly every one of them met a violent end. Lysimachus, killed in battle against Seleucus. Seleucus himself, assassinated by Ptolemy Ceraunus, the son of Ptolemy I. Ptolemy Ceraunus would go on to rule Macedon, but not for very long. The death of Lysimachus had left the Danube border of the Macedonian kingdom open to barbarian invasions, and soon tribes of Gauls were rampaging through Macedon and Greece and invading Asia Minor. Ptolemy Ceraunus was killed by the invaders, and after several years of chaos, Demetrius emerged as ruler after defeating Cassander's heirs, but eventually lost everything and died a prisoner. In Asia, Seleucus's son, Antiochus I, also managed to defeat the Celtic invaders, who settled down in central Anatolia in the part of eastern Phrygia that would henceforward be known as Galatia after them. The partition of Babylon, the first great division of Alexander's empire, had been drawn in ink. But the true borders of the Hellenistic world would be written in blood. And yet, for all their ambition, for all their relentless struggle, none of them would ever achieve what Alexander had. For nearly 50 years, the greatest military minds of their age tore each other apart in a series of brutal, relentless conflicts we call the Wars of the Diadochi. These wars weren't just about winning battles. They were about assassination, betrayal, backstabbing, and the kind of power plays that would make Game of Thrones look tame. Alliances were made and broken. Rulers were poisoned. Heirs were strangled in their beds. Whole cities were wiped off the map. It was like the apocalypse had come for the Greek world. The thing is, if you were watching this happen in real time, you wouldn't be thinking about Rome. Rome was still just some growing republic in Italy, fighting its neighbors and figuring out how to run itself. But what nobody realized at the time, what's only obvious in hindsight, is that these wars were laying the groundwork for Rome to take over the entire Eastern Mediterranean. If Alexander had lived another 20 years, imagine what he could have built. Maybe Rome never rises the way it did. Maybe the legions never even make it to Greece. But he didn't live, and because of that, his empire fell apart, leaving behind something Rome could exploit centuries later. The Greek world after Alexander wasn't just divided, it was perpetually at war. Every kingdom was locked in a struggle for dominance, and that meant endless battles, shifting alliances, and economic exhaustion. This did two things. First, it weakened the Hellenistic world. The manpower and resources of Greece, Egypt, and Persia were poured into wars that solved nothing. Entire generations were wiped out in these conflicts. The grand armies of the Diadochi, huge phalanxes, war elephants, elite cavalry were incredibly expensive to maintain. And after decades of fighting, these kingdoms were running out of money and soldiers. Second, it made it easy for Rome to step in as the deciding factor. Think about it. If the Greek world had been united, Rome would have had to face a single, powerful enemy. Instead, every Greek kingdom saw Rome as a potential ally against its rivals. So, when Rome started flexing its muscles in the Eastern Mediterranean, they didn't meet unified resistance. They met a fractured, squabbling mess, one that they could manipulate. From that moment on, the writing was on the wall. Rome was the new dominant power. Now, here's the big question. What if the wars of the Diadochi hadn't happened? What if Alexander's empire had stayed together? Well, for starters, Rome would have had way more trouble expanding east. Instead of fighting fractured Greek states, they would have faced a powerful, unified empire, an empire built on the best military traditions of Greece and Persia, an empire with the resources of Egypt and Mesopotamia behind it. Would Rome have ever made it past the Adriatic? Would they have even bothered trying? Maybe not. But that's not what happened. The wars of the Diadochi shattered Alexander's empire, leaving behind weak, divided kingdoms. And when Rome came knocking, they didn't find an unstoppable force. They found a collection of states too busy fighting each other to put up a real resistance. This is one of those moments in history where everything could have turned out differently. If Alexander had lived, if his empire had held together, if the Diadochi hadn't torn it apart. But they did. And that's why, a few centuries later, it wasn't a Greek-speaking empire ruling the Mediterranean. It was Rome.